Thank you, Brother Bill. I appreciate the statement about me being one of your favorites. Of course, what he doesn't tell you is that his favorites are in the 10,000s. Okay. And when is Pastor Miss Debbie coming back from Alabama? Do we know? Saturday? Okay. There is a question. Will he be coming back with a banjo on his knee? Think about that one for a minute. Okay. Now you got me losing my train of thought, which is not that hard. If you wouldn't mind, if you'd go ahead and stand and open your Bible to the book of Galatians, and just a moment. We have the book of Galatians, chapter 6. This verse, there's actually two verses that I want us to look at tonight that are going to kind of give us a lead into our discussion this evening. And I'll be honest with you, this is not going to be completed tonight. I can tell you that right now. This is actually a multi-week lesson, and Brother Isbell didn't realize it when he asked me to speak that I was prepping for taking over his pulpit for the next couple of weeks. But if you wouldn't mind, please open up to the book of Galatians chapter 6, and we're going to look at two verses. And it's starting with verse number 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Verse 8. For he that soweth to his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth to the Spirit of the Spirit reap life everlasting. You may be seated for those of you in the auditorium tonight. Back in January, when I was given the opportunity to speak and actually bring the morning Sunday school lesson for Brother Dombacher, who was out of the city, was on a matter of leadership. And I figured that this would be a good theme to continue because this is a year that the United States is considering electing a new, what we call, a leader. This is going to be an election year, and there's about a third of the states are having their senators up for election. And then there is also those in the House of Representatives. Every one of them will be up for election this year. And then in the general election, we'll also vote for a president and a vice president. So we need to be aware of the fact that leadership is something that is important, that we should place high value on in those men and women that we put into position. And in January, when I had opportunity to bring a lesson, I talked about what happens when leadership is absent. Well, tonight, and starting this lesson and continuing when I have opportunity, when Brother Isbell lets me get behind the mic again, I'm going to talk about what happens when leadership is out of place. And we're going to use David as discussed and as exemplified in the book of 2 Samuel as our example to see what happens to an individual and what happens to a family, what happens to a nation when an appointed leader does not do his job. Now, as a matter of introduction, and I'm going to use this contrivance here, so you'll have to bear with me. Which one is it? Is it the right arrow? Okay. As a matter of introduction, I've got a phrase up there, the world wonders. Now, some of you are probably already saying, what is he got in mind or up his sleeve about the introduction? It's ironic, but as a retired member of the United States Air Force, I have an interest in naval history. In particular, the United States Navy during the Second World War. And I was recently reading about the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And if any of you are familiar with the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was described as being the largest naval action in the South Pacific between the United States and the Empire of Japan. It involved capital ships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers, thousands of GIs, and sailors and aviators on both sides. And the purpose was for the United States in their attempt to try to retake over lands that had been lost through Japanese conquest to reoccupy the Philippines. In October of 1944, the United States attempted their landings at Leyte, which is an island in the Philippines, as part of this. Now, the Japanese were well aware of what the United States plans were. They were not fooled at all by what we were going to be doing. They knew that the Philippines was a stepping stone, and then eventually there would be another stepping stone that would probably be one of the islands south of Japan. And as it turned out, it was Iwo Jima. Then it was Okinawa, and then eventually Japan figured they were going to be the target. So they were prepared when the United States started to land in October of 1944 in Leyte. They had all of their capital ships they still had in their Navy, and they were still a formidable task force, even though they had suffered severe losses at Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and Midway. The Japanese were going to put all the forces they had into attacking the United States landing forces there at Leyte. And one of the key elements of their attack plan was to provide a diversion, hoping to pull off the United States fast carriers and battleships in order to make their landing forces, the United States landing forces, vulnerable to attack by Japan's battleships. The diversion worked. Japan sent a number of expendable small carriers, which had no aircraft, north, and they pulled off a fleet of battleships and carriers that was led by Admiral William Halsey. Admiral William Halsey had not conducted any kind of a conference with his boss, who was Admiral Nimitz, who was the chief of the Pacific Forces for the United States Navy, prior to him doing that. And unfortunately, he also had not discussed the matter with the admirals that were in charge of the landing in Leyte, including Admiral Kincaid. With Halsey going north after what he thought was a main fleet of aircraft carriers, what he did was he left the United States vulnerable to attack from the north. And that's where the Japanese decided to send their battleships. The result was a battle that, if some of you have followed naval history, will know came out to be, unfortunately for the men who were in it, but for the United States, one of its glorious moments of spirited warfare. The United States, with a small fleet of destroyers and escort carriers, fought off Japan's biggest ships, including the Musashi and the Yamato, which were the largest battleships in the world, and a fleet of cruisers and a fleet of destroyers. And with just a handful of small, what they called tin can destroyers and destroyer escorts, they caused great confusion among the Japanese and caused them to go and turn around and head back to the west. During the middle of the battle, though, the fortunes were not so good for the Americans. In fact, Admiral Kincaid was desperate. He was wondering what had happened to his northern protection. And so he sent out a number of messages to Admiral Halsey asking him where he was. Where was the protective cover of the battleships? Where was the protective cover of the aircraft on the fast carriers? He sent out 3 desperate messages, each one more severe in its tone, asking him to please return back. In the middle of all this, Admiral Nimitz in Pearl Harbor was monitoring radio traffic, and he heard this. And so he decided to send a message to Admiral Halsey as well and say, where, I repeat, where is Task Force 3-5? The world is wondering. Now, this statement, "the world is wondering," is a statement that was not intended to be appended to the message. It was actually a piece of encryption that was supposed to add what you would call fluff to a message in case Japanese cryptographers were trying to break our code, and it was not intended to be included as part of the message. It was something the radio cryptographer on the United States naval side had added just at the end as a piece of buffer at the end of the message. But unfortunately, it had been unencrypted and added to the message that Admiral Halsey got. "The world wonders." And that he took as a stern rebuke for what he had done. In turn, he threw down his hat, and those that were present said he went into a fit. One of the few times they say the man ever lost his cool because he felt he was being embarrassed for his actions, which he thought were good, during the middle of a battle. The problem is that his actions, although he thought they were good, left others vulnerable. And that's the discussion we have tonight, which is what happens when leadership is absent. And we're going to use as our text 2 Samuel chapter 11. So if you'll turn over with me to 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're going to take a look at the life of David. David, who was king at this point in the nation of Israel's history, had finally settled most of the battles with his enemies. And he was at this point looking to reign and then do the things that he had promised himself and God he was going to do. He was going to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. He was going to build God a temple that was fitting for God's presence. Those were things that he had in plans. But then all of a sudden, things turned south for him. And those are things that we're going to take a look at briefly in the few minutes that we have here today. And it started with a simple act. A simple act. And that act is described for us in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And let's turn to verse 1. "And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they battled the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David tarried still at Jerusalem." The main point that we're going to look at in this verse is the fact that David was not where he was supposed to be. He was the king of the nation of Israel. He had decided, though, at this time, according to commentators, that maybe because of age, maybe because he'd always been at the head of each battle, maybe this was a point that maybe he didn't need to be present when the nation of Israel went out to war, because this was not considered to be a major battle. They were not fighting an enemy whom they felt would overtake the land. There was an enemy, Ammon, that was on their border that God had asked the nation of Israel to remove altogether, but they were not, in the sense, a threat to overcome or overwhelm the nation of Israel. So some think that David just felt that it wasn't necessary that he had to be present there. Other commentators have speculated that maybe David at his age, advanced age of 50, who had seen, his body had seen so many battles, was at a point where he just wanted to take it easy. He wanted to possibly enjoy this city of Jerusalem and this palace that he had built for himself, enjoy the comforts of home. He had been a man on the move most of his life. Now was a possibility that he could settle down as king and be a homebody, so to speak. But the Bible makes it clear to us that God didn't consider that to be a wise option. As you'll see in verse 1, the very word that we see says, "But David tarried still at Jerusalem." God is setting us up to understand that this was not God's plan, that God knew that David should have been with the nation of Israel in battle. This was not where David needed to be. David was in Jerusalem, and his country was fighting an enemy, and he wasn't there. In verse 2, we can see that David is agitated. And it says, "And it came to pass in eventide that David arose from off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon." Now, once again, commentators speculate as to the reason why David was agitated and why he was up in the middle of the night. They say perhaps his conscience was bothering him. This was actually the first time he had not been at the forefront leading the army, and he felt guilty about it. Or it could have been like a father who's anxious about letting his child do something that he has in the past protected him from, kind of like when a dad fears for his teenage son or daughter when they get the keys to the car after they've gotten their license and they're going to go out for that first drive by themselves. But nevertheless, David is up and he's on the rooftop, and he sees something that is happening right next to him. Now, to understand how he could view this, you have to understand a little bit about the architecture of the city of Jerusalem. City of Jerusalem is an old city, and is most of the architecture in the Middle of the East. They have flat roofs. Because there's no air conditioning, most of the time people will go up to the top, to the roof, when they want to socialize or do things as prepared dinners. Oftentimes the stove or the oven is on the roof. It's the central family meeting place for most families who have a home. And in this case, David went up to the roof because it was a place where he thought he could be refreshed by the cool night air. And when he looked out, he saw on an adjoining roof, not that far from him, a sight that he hadn't seen before. It was a young woman who was taking a bath. Now, the point here is not that David saw a woman taking a bath. He was a married man. He probably had seen women take baths quite often. But the point was, this was not his wife. And even though he is agitated, he is still attracted to this sight. Now, as we'll see, the problem is not that David saw a woman taking a bath. Sometimes we often see things that we are not supposed to see accidentally. The problem is not that when we gaze on something we're supposed to see, that temptation is presented. No, the problem is when we return our gaze. And as we saw in this verses 2 and 3, David turned and he looked and he stared. In verse 2, it said from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. So it wasn't David saying, "Oh, there's somebody washing themselves. I think I'll go over to here this side." No, he stopped and he looked long enough to gauge her beauty. And then in verse 3 it says, "And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, 'Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?'" So now David has been presented with a temptation. He had a decision to make. Do I turn away? Do I ignore it? Or do I look? And he looked. And he went even further in this case. He went in and he gave his servants instructions to find out who this woman was. And they told him who it was. So now temptation is given over to the pathway to sin. He's looked, he's gazed, and now he has thoughts in his mind. Verse 4, David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, and for she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. In very simple language, the Bible tells us the ugly story of this, the ugly point of this story, and it cannot be missed. David had been provided with a temptation. He could have turned away, but he gave in to it, and as a result, sin was evident. It says that he lay with her in verse 4. Now in verse 5, His wrongful actions have an unintended but not unforeseen consequence. The sinful act bears fruit, so to speak. Now, what is David going to do? He's sinned, but is he going to confess? Or is he going to cover it up? This is not an unmarried maiden. This is someone else's wife. So he has created an act of adultery with her. And she tells him that she's going to have a baby. And it's not her husband's, it's his. David, if he was right with God, would confess his sin, and he would try to do right by her husband, Uriah the Hittite. He has a choice, but what's he going to do? Is he going to confess, or is he going to cover it up? Now, in verses 6 through 8, we are told his decision. Looking at verse 6, it says, And David sent to Joab, saying, Send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David, and when Uriah was come unto him, David demanded him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. And David said to Uriah, Go down to thy house and wash thy feet. And Uriah departed out of the king's house. There followed him a mess of meat from the king. I like that. He must have been from the south. A mess of meat. No, he's not going to confess. He didn't call Uriah from the battlefront, faithful warrior, serves to the king, to tell him what he had done, what he was. Is there a ghost in here? Okay. What he was going to do is he's going to try to entice him to go home, take a little R&R, and go to his house, and presumably give David excuse to say the child is not David's, the child is going to be Uriah's. He's going to try to cover up his sin. And we see in verse 9 that Uriah was an honorable man more than the king was. In verse 9, Uriah was a great man. It says in verse 9, But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and went not down to his house. And he gives a reason why. And they told David in verse 10, Uriah went not down to his house. And David said unto Uriah, Camest thou not from thy journey? Why then didst thou not go down unto thy house? And Uriah gives a very plausible reason and a very good explanation as to why he didn't do it. He said unto David, The ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife, as thou livest and as thy soul liveth? I will not do this thing. He was conscious of the sacrifice the men in the field were making, and he felt that even though he had been summoned by the king, he shouldn't take advantage of it. He should use the opportunity to still show that he was allied with them by not enjoying the comforts of home, but still sleeping on a hard floor. Even though he had to be there in Jerusalem, he knew that the best thing he could do is not to allay himself with these privileges that were provided. Unfortunately for David, that had defeated David's whole plan. David's duplicity has to increase now, because the first attempt to try to cause this act that he is engaged in, this sin, to be covered up, now he has to go further into duplicity and try to get Uriah drunk. And David said unto Uriah in verse 12, tarry here today also and tomorrow, and I will let thee depart. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. And when David had called him, he did eat and drink before, and he made him drunk. And at even he went out to lie in his bed with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his house. So David's thinking, what soldier will pass up an opportunity to have a drink? And when he's drunk, his guard will be down. He won't be so stern or as loyal now. He'll probably think about his wife and that nice, comfortable bed he's got in his house. But Uriah didn't do it. Uriah went down and slept with the servants, still cognizant of the fact that he was there while his allies were out in the field suffering. So now, what is David going to do? 2 attempts he's tried to get Uriah to help him unexpectedly cover up this adultery that David has engaged in, this sin. So what's he going to do? In verse 14 and 15, we see that this draws David deeper into sin. 14 says, and it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote it in the letter saying, set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. So we started off with a man who wasn't in the place where he should have been. He should have been with his troops. His guilty conscience leads him up to a rooftop where he spies a woman taking a bath. He could have turned away, but yet he's gazed. And his gaze caused him to lust, and his lust caused him to inquire who it was. That lust was culminated in an adulterous affair with this woman, and now a child is on the way. He has tried to cover it up with no success, and we come to now he is plotting murder. David is plotting the death of this man, Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier, a man loyal to the crown and to the king and to the nation of Israel. Verse 16, and it came to pass when Joab observed the city that he assigned Uriah unto a place where they knew that valiant men were, and the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Some commentators have described as a setup in the sense that they went up to right next to the city walls, right where the battle was the fiercest, and then Uriah's companions under the order of Joab pulled back, leaving Uriah by himself. And the essence is, as we're told, that Uriah the Hittite dies. So it started with David not being where he should have been, which leads to adultery, which leads to an unwanted child. But now we have David also into conspiracy, which results into murder. In verses 18 through 24, we see Job's message to David. Then Job told David all the things concerning the war, and charged the messenger, saying, when thou hast made an end of telling the matters of the war unto the king, and if so be that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, whereunto approached ye so nigh unto the city where ye did fight? Knew ye not that they would shoot from the wall? So David's a general. He knows that strategically being against the wall is not a good idea, especially out in the open. And any good general will try to avoid that, leaving your men out in the open. And Joab knows that he's going to be questioned about this tactic. But Joab has something that he's got in addition to say to David, whom he knows will shut him up. Joab goes on further and says, who smote Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth. So Joab knows that in the past, being next to the walls of a city while you're besieging it is not the best place to be, because we have an example from biblical history where people have died. Women have cast a piece of a millstone from the wall. An individual has died. Abimelech has died. And why went ye nigh to the wall? Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So, Joab figures David, when he reads the message, will get hot under the collar, but this last line should freeze him in his track. Mission accomplished, so to speak. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him for, and the messenger said unto David, surely the men prevailed against us, and came out unto us into the field, and we were upon them even unto the entering of the gate. And the shooters shot from off the wall unto the servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. A noble soldier in the service of the king and the nation of Israel, Uriah was dead. Rather peculiar to mention just one death, as we can imagine others probably died in that same battle. But it's important that David know that the ulterior motive in which he had set out has been fulfilled. The man whom he has seen as an impediment in his attempt to try to cover up this tragic adulterous affair, the husband of the woman that he has committed adultery with, he's dead now. So now that leaves David open to do what he wants to do next. Then David said unto the messenger in verse 25, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as another. Make the battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. So David's reply to the message is pious, although ironic words. He doesn't realize how much he is going to rue the day that he made this comment about the sword devouring one as well as another, because he himself will witness it personally within his family. He thinks he can cast off blame or with sentiment, false sentiment, but the reality is that that sentiment is going to be true. Nevertheless, the sword will indeed devour, and it's going to devour his family, as we will see in the coming weeks when we look at the further chapters. The end result, verse 26, David has cleared the path through his conspiracy with Joab. The husband is now dead. The wife is free to remarry, and she is going, of course, to marry the king. No one is going to question this, that a woman that is married to the king is going to have a child. They're not going to count up the days and look at a calendar and say, well, let's see, they were married 3 months ago and she's having a baby. No one would dare say that about the king. It's noble, it's good enough that the king is married to this woman. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband, as well she should. But I kind of read between the lines in here that you almost sense that she was not too upset. It doesn't talk about it explicitly in this, and we're not going to go into victim blaming, but there's a backstory that's not mentioned in this about possibly Bathsheba's contributions to this whole affair. The questions arise in the minds of why was she up there on the top, on the roof, bathing well within sight of the palace? A suspicious mind would ask themselves, did she intentionally do that, knowing that the king was not at battle, that possibly he would see her, that maybe she was trading up from a common GI to now she's got the king and the chief general herself. Verse 27, and when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him his son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. David thinks to himself, well, it worked. It was messy, but I did achieve what I need to do to cover up this sin. She's my wife now, and we're going to have a baby. The problem is David doesn't realize, or he's forgotten, that it's not just the city of Jerusalem that's going to question this, or Joab who's going to question these tactics that David has sent him out to essay in the battle. There's another person who sees all. This may be the end of the chapter, but it's not the end of the story. What David had done had displeased the Lord. As we go on, as we'll see in the following weeks, as we look at chapters 12 through 18, we'll see that there is a pronouncement made on David's sin. This pronouncement is going to be a fearful one, that David will rue and think back, I'm sure, to that one time when he was on the top of a rooftop, when he should have been somewhere else. And as a result, from not being where he was supposed to be, it causes the destruction of his family and others around him. So, getting back to the book of Galatians, Paul writes and tells us, be not deceived. God is not mocked. This story, David is trying to fool everyone, but he himself is the bigger fool because he doesn't think about the fact that there's someone he cannot fool, and that is the overseeing God. So that